Je m'appelle Goudagnan, chargé de modérer cette 6e session qui porte sur à l'épreuve des frontières maritimes. Je vais m'arrimer à ce que mon prédécesseur modérateur avait dit au plan théorique, mais pas dans la pratique, parce qu'on a vu vraiment que ça a débordé. Et nous risquons, à la limite, d'avoir une salle vide. Donc, notre discutant, Goudagnan, je suis bien entendu membre du bureau confédéral de la Confédération nationale des travailleurs du Sénégal, CNTS. Je m'en limite à ça parce que je pense que c'est un honneur qu'on fait à ce syndicat en me choisissant comme modérateur. Parce que j'aurais pu parler de Goudagnan comme secrétaire général de l'Union des enseignants du Sénégal. J'aurais dû aussi pu parler de Goudagnan comme membre du Conseil économique et social du Sénégal, de la République du Sénégal. Donc notre discutant, ce sera Ababacar Fall, qui est au niveau de l'Institut des études avancées de Saint-Louis comme chargé de mission. Nous aurons droit aussi à 4 communications. La première, ce sera Prena Agarwal de l'Université de Göttingen en Allemagne et Max Weber Stigfoot de India Branch Office. Je ne sais pas si j'ai bien prononcé. Et ils vont nous entretenir sur le thème travail, mobilité et partition. Les travailleurs maritimes et le tracé des frontières dans le Bengale au XXe siècle. La deuxième communication, ce sera le résultat de recherche de Laura Channing de l'Université de Durham et Browen Everill de l'Université de Cambridge en Angleterre. Et ils vont nous entretenir de leur travail sur travail occasionnel et stratégie des ménages dans un port africain. La troisième communication nous sera présentée par Hilary G. Jones de l'Université de Kentucky aux États-Unis et portera sur le thème de la Martinique au Sénégal, esclavage, déportation et nouvelles frontières du travail dans le monde atlantique. Et enfin, M. Abdoulaye Sène de l'Université Cheikh Anta Diop va nous entretenir de sa recherche sur les pêcheurs en Afrique de l'Ouest, mobilité et défis frontaliers. Je l'ai dit, nous allons nous arrimer à la théorie de mon prédécesseur et on va vraiment nous accorder à ça, c'est-à-dire 15 minutes pour les panélistes, 5 minutes pour les questions, 10 minutes pour le discutant. Et tout à fait, tout à fait. Donc sans protocole, sans tarder, nous allons donc donner à Madame Prena Agarwal de l'Université de Göttingen la parole.
Hi everyone. I'm very happy to be here and thank you to the organizers for organizing this very great conference. So I don't control the PowerPoint presentation, so I don't know how this will work exactly, but anyways.
Slide. Just say slide.
Oh, I say slide every time. Okay, okay. Yeah, that would be useful.
You see?
Yeah, more or less, yeah. Okay, should I start? Yeah? Yeah? Okay. Today I'll present to you part of my PhD research, which is finished, but this is part of my book chapter, which is to do with the dock workers and the partition of India. So maybe you can change the slide, please. So let me tell you very briefly the sort of the historiography that exists about the important period of the 1940s, which is the period of Indian decolonization, and what I'm going to do differently. So what you have is for 1940s, that decade in India is seen in two ways. One is a peaceful and a negotiated transfer of power from the British to India, from Britain to British to Indians, and or as a story of the partition of India on communal lines between Hindus and Muslims. And so and the subalterns entered this slowly. Okay, and the subalterns entered this stage either as victims or perpetrators of the partition. And what I'm interested in is to look at the meanings and implications of the participation by workers, by subalterns, in the shaping of independence beyond partition, beyond politics of communal identity, which in this period seems to assume the most important role. And so what I'm going to do today is to try and connect the labor question to the partition through the case of maritime workers whose work required mobility across the frontiers of Bengal. And I'll kind of focus on a particular section of maritime workers, which I will come to. So here you see the map of South Asia in 1947, and you see the province of Bengal, which I focus on, which is one of the regions of the two which was partitioned, and the other is obviously in the west with Punjab. So what has happened to the story of 1940s and of the history of this period is a classic case of looking at history backwards. So it's as if the only outcome of the 1940s was going to be the partition of the subcontinent. And so there were many possibilities, which historians are beginning to argue now, or maybe you change the slide, possibilities which were closed in the late 1940s and early 50s, which are forgotten. This is quite similar to what also happened in the case of African decolonization, which, for instance, Fred Cooper has talked about. Recent research has shown that labor in the 1940s became a very important question, with the largest number of strikes in colonial India, which, for instance, has a huge impact for Congress party, which is, for instance, Ravi Ahuja has shown is very sort of visible in the density of legislative activity in this period. And so the framework of Indian labor laws is really set in this period. And so what I think needs to be done is to sort of is to see the 1940s as a complex historical moment which had varied, shifting and competing tendencies, but in the existing historiography it is flattened by only talking about the communal partition of the country. So what happens in this period is that the deadliest communal riots and the intensification of communal identity also alternates with the most powerful episodes of labor politics, where unity across religious lines is propagated and practiced. So the swings between hope and despair, violence and solidarity are very sharp. But what I think we have found very difficult to do in Indian history is to understand and engage with this complexity of this political moment, which is multidimensional. And so the lens of labor politics, I argue, will help us widen the historiography of the 1940s by taking into account the divergent and the thwarted political possibilities of the time. And so there is also a tendency to either look at labor politics or to look at the partition, the communal partition. But what I'm going to try and do with this paper is to argue that, I mean, these are part of the same historical context and have to be sort of seen together. And how do we do that? So my focus will be on the dock workers of undivided Bengal who, so there were two types. Usually when we talk about dock workers, we think of loading and unloading workers, which is one. I'm not going to talk about them today. And then you have the seamen. Seamen, in the region of Bengal, you have 100,000 seamen employed in the inland and the ocean-going ships. I will mainly talk about the inland seamen, the mariners, who were largely Muslim from eastern Bengal. There were 50,000 of them employed in the sort of inland waterways which connected eastern India from Assam to Bihar. So, I kind of present two moments and two strikes in the late 1940s and early 50s. One is the Calcutta port strike of 1947, which happens after the deadliest riot of 1946, also known as the Great Calcutta Killing, which is seen to have set the sort of series of communal riots that rocked India in 1946. So this is a sort of the beginning of the partition riots. But even after the riots in 1946, August, you have the strike of port workers, which is planned, which is kind of postponed, but it does happen. And it is the largest strike that happens in Calcutta Port Trust, which includes contracted out workers, casual workers, permanent workers, mariners and dock workers, Hindu and Muslim workers. And especially mariners are important here because they came from, they are the Muslims from East Bengal who are kind of immediately facing the question that they will not be, that their nationality will not be the same anymore and they may be sort of become Pakistanis. But even so, what you have is the strike in which they participate with Hindu workers. And so what I argue with this strike is that there is a sort of a visible workers' way in the shadow of the communal riots. This long-planned and well-organized strike takes place in 1947, and workers win the concession of parity with the wages and allowances of central government employees, and that is very important in sort of port workers becoming part of the formal sector. So that strike happens, and after that you have the partition of Bengal, and in that what happens is that the West Bengal government has huge issues because most of the mariners belong to what is now Bangladesh, what is now East Bengal, Pakistan. So the ocean-going and inland crews, and they kind of had quite an amount of training, so you could not kind of replace them that easily. So you have these crews who are now Pakistani nationals, and so that creates a lot of issues for the West Bengal government, and so they start to promise that they will set up training for Indian nationals as early as 1947, and this training will be for the refugees, the Hindu refugees from East Bengal. And training also starts in 1950 in the docks. Okay. And the Pakistani side also has the same problem. These are the most sort of important workers, transport workers, and they try to establish a certain statutory control over these workers. In all this, the employers actually do not want these changes to happen because these workers are quite skilled, and they would want that the Indian government and the Pakistani government comes together to form a maritime board through which these workers, sort of the same workers, remain employed. But as we will see, this becomes really complicated to have, workers employed through the same agency when sort of you have two countries, India and Pakistan. So, and what kind of brings all these problems to a head is the strike of mariners in 1952, which is a very interesting strike because it happens across the newly established borders. The inland mariners go on a general strike in Bengal in October-November 1952. This strike is led by an Indian communist, Mansoor Gilani, in Calcutta, and it spreads across Bengal. The strike carries on longest in a port, small port, across the Indian border in Pakistan. Indian state authorities cannot intervene because this is a strike in Pakistan, and the Pakistani authorities did not care to intervene since these were only on the Indian registered vessels. And the British employers who sort of run these smaller ships, vessels, are extremely confused about how the strike was carried on for a month across frontiers. And they set up an inquiry committee to understand exactly how the networks of these mariners worked. And this inquiry committee is not interested in anything to do with demands, etc., but in particular how the strike could have carried on for such a long time. And it gives you us an interesting view of how this happened. So they have a strike committee established on a vessel, Taraki. They have interception vessels, which are used for holding up all the rest of the vessels in a particular port, which is crucial for stopping traffic along the Bengal waterways. They establish efficient communications for passing information across the East-West Bengal frontier in a context of written and oral rumors. And they also have a volunteer group for imposing strike action on vessels and stopping them. And so what really confuses the employers, and mainly I have looked at the reports of the employers, is that these sort of newly minted Pakistani, quote-unquote Pakistani workers are not listening to the Pakistani leaders of their trade union. The erstwhile union leaders, Faiz Ahmed and Qasim, were seen as too close to the new government. And they continuously say, for instance, they argue that the vast majority of workers were Pakistani, yet they were quite unwilling to listen to their own government officials and police. And this is really sort of has to be understood in a context, the partition has really just happened, a few years back. And communal tensions are very high, and that is why this period is seen in the historiography as if no other collective identity could have been important in a period like this. Only the identities, religious identities, would be important, or the national identities. But you see, yeah, you can maybe go to the next minute.
2 minutes.
Okay. So yeah, I will maybe sort of summarize the arguments I'm trying to make with this paper. So what you see is that the historiography is really sort of obsessed with the communal question and the related refugee question for this period, especially in Bengal, which sees the partition happening, right? And what sort of this research shows us that there was politics beyond religion and nationality even in this period, this very formative period for post-colonial India. And you had powerful class solidarities which connected dock workers not just before the partition but also in the aftermath of the partition. So this is not, yeah, this is yeah, I'll come to that. And so we have been discussing about the political boundaries and how political boundaries do not necessarily sort of mean or do not coincide with all kinds of other boundaries, and frontiers are drawn through various processes, right? And what we see here is that the making of political boundaries in Bengal did not coincide with the drawing of frontiers in the world of work and labor. So that is a sort of more drawn out process that happens over time, and I think it has to be sort of understood in that way. So recently research, you can maybe switch, yeah, has started to question if 1947, is the sort of neat end point of partition. And my research contributes to this, this kind of idea of a long partition of the Indian subcontinent, which Wazira Zamindar has, for instance, talked about with respect to Delhi. And I mean, what I'm trying to argue is that if the identities of Hindus and Muslims were the products of interwar period, the identities of Indians and Pakistanis were also historical products of the making of rival nation states in South Asia in the 1950s and the 1960s. These were not identities which were sort of, they kind of didn't just arrive. They were a product of drawn out historical processes from the late 40s, 50s onward. And kind of another way to pose this question is how did, the poor Muslim neighborhoods in urban India start to be known as mini Pakistans? And I think the bringing of the category of labor helps to understand how these categories were produced, how these identities were produced on the ground. And it's through three processes, I think, that happens in the 1950s Bengal or in Calcutta, which first is the question of employment of Hindu refugees, which becomes extremely important for the new post-colonial government. The maintenance of law and order at the workplace is another very important factor. And finally, it's the sort of everyday bureaucratic violence which is associated with the sort of marking of identity and the anxieties which nation states share about cross-border activity. So yeah, I will stop here and I look forward to that.
Merci. Elle est dans le temps. Elle n'a empiété que d'1 minute. Donc nous allons passer au partage du travail de Laura Channing et Browan Avery. Oui, Stanley. C'est bon?
Laura Channing, and we're going to talk about our paper, Casual Labor and Household Strategies in African Work.
Okay, so historians have long been fascinated by the question of poverty in Africa. Different ways of measuring and assessing poverty through access to basic needs, levels of inequality, individual social mobility, national or colonial or even pre-colonial economic growth, growth in heights, and intellectual and linguistic evidence about local ideas of what poverty constituted have all contributed to expanding and contextualizing historical understandings of African experiences of wealth and poverty in the past. The emergence of the welfare ratio in the economic history literature has provided a fruitful ground for quantifying these approaches. Ewout van Kamer and Marlis van Wijzenberg's contribution of African wage data to the broad comparative and international project of understanding wages and growth in the 19th and 20th century has generated interventions that have collectively helped to demonstrate that, quote, the whole idea that Africa has been the poorest and most slowly growing region since the Industrial Revolution, let alone the 1500s, is based on a backward extrapolation of post-1960 growth experiences without a solid empirical foundation. So they've shown that places like Freetown in Sierra Leone, the welfare ratio was high and growing during the colonial period.
And so our paper looks at this period and its labor practices and thinks about what was observed at the time. So we're looking at the long 19th century, but particularly we're focused on one moment in the 19th century to think about why these wages are being reported as high, and why there were observations at the time of what we would now refer to as a hustle economy, right? So why there's lots of precarious labor. And our conclusion is effectively that wages were not good enough to feed a family. There was no male breadwinner in these situations. Everyone was doing lots of precarious gig work. So the rise of informal precarious labor associated with the gig economy has generated renewed interest in pre-industrial urban labor and standards of living. Freetown, Sierra Leone provides an interesting window into the ways that port cities organized household labor in the 19th century. So building on this recent work on the standard of living and the welfare ratio, we use the unique 1831 census from Freetown as historical documentation of the colonial government's own understanding of the minimum welfare ratio to examine how people organize their households to absorb the shocks of the sporadic wages in port city life. The irregular, precarious, and informal nature of the port economy helps to explain the ways that the patterns of wages were incorporated into household occupational structures in Freetown. And we're particularly interested in women's wages in these cities and how they factor into what has been in the literature the sort of dominance of the idea of the male breadwinner. This slide shows the welfare ratio around this period of the 1831 census, looking at per adult per day. And then the next slide shows the welfare ratio, assuming this male breadwinner and 4 dependents, which is the sort of standard in the literature, and shows how far below the sort of welfare ratio standard of 1 this would entail. So what we're trying to understand is the contribution of other family members to achieving an acceptable standard. So when the colonial government of Sierra Leone undertook a house-by-house census of its population in 1831, they captured a moment in the economic history of an African Atlantic port town. What the town's occupational structure and household makeup reveals is a deep history of informal, seasonal, flexible, service-oriented wage labor and the mobilization of household resources. Colonial officials were concerned about assessing the standards of living in the city and about how Freetown's residents made money and used it. They wanted to know how much a subsistence basket cost. They reported the cost of labor. They came up with strategies for dealing with what they termed quote, idleness that resulted from seasonal underemployment. And they trained women in domestic work and fretted about the non-nuclear families that made up many households. But they were also proud of Freetown's entrepreneurial spirit, and when they weren't confronting the town's mercantile and professional class over colonial policy, they were praising the successes of their policy of civilization, commerce, and Christianity and spreading British values to Africa. So they sort of wanted it both ways. They were really concerned about seasonal underemployment, but they were also very sort of proud of the entrepreneurial, hustling culture of Freetown's port economy. And so we have, to build our welfare ratio, we have these data from Blue Books reporting prices, reporting wages. We have the prison rations calculations from Blue Books as well that sort of give us a rough estimate of how much it costs at various levels of subsistence in this period.
So this is a page from the 1831 census for part of Freetown that we digitized to give us a sense of who these people were, what kinds of occupations were making up firstly this part of the city and also each individual household, so we could get a sense of the types of wages and the types of occupations that made up a composite household income. So what we did is we digitized a section of this and then we were able to kind of give outlines such as this. This is like the occupations that are represented in the 1831 census that we've categorized into these different sections of types of occupation or types of labor.
And so what we were able to do was use real households to work out how people were living together and how they were making money for paying their various bills in Freetown. And an important component of that, as we've suggested, is the role of women's employment. Across Africa, women's informal employment in cash work, in providing meals to migrant workers, or participating in migrant mining communities, or in prostitution or beer brewing has been used to underscore the importance of informal labor's relationship with providing household comforts, either to migrant male laborers or through the financial gains of the work in providing for their families. Polly Hill lamented the statistical invisibility of women's work in African economic indicators, pointing out the uncertainty as to the extent to which husbands, in fact, provide for their wives, when in many West African cases, women are actually expected to procure some of the food required by themselves and their children, especially in certain seasons. And so this breakdown of gender and age of employment shows the ways that women were involved in retail, in domestic labor, but also in other sort of regards to trades and in some other capacities as well. So in Eastern Freetown, which is what the sort of part of the census that we use because it has detailed breakdowns of who's in the household, 47% of households had 2 earners, and 19% of households had more than 2 earners. Only 5% of non-European households had a single male earner. In other words, nearly all women did some amount of work outside of the house. Mixed multiple earner households included older children or unmarried siblings. A household like number 5, Water Street, for example, had Mrs. and Nancy Jordan, both charwomen, Mingo Jordan, a sawyer, Rosiana, a little child, as well as Moses Murray, a fisherman. As the Yoruba proverb made clear, a guest who is no advantage to a person is selfish. He who eats the sweet should also eat the sour. As the explorer Richard Burton translated this in 1865, it meant everyone in a household was expected to pitch in. What we also found at the census was that if a laborer or a tradesman was married, the wife was more likely to be a, quote, market woman than any other occupation. Anecdotes about the growing wealth of market women and market men, and concern in the colonial government about the proliferation of merchants rather than agriculturalists can tell us something about their predominance in the city's economy. Christopher Fife describes people in Freetown Market selling cut timber, lime from burnt oyster shells, cotton lampwicks made from bush cotton, soap manufactured at Bathurst in the Gambia, cattle brought from the Thème and Fulla, rice from Sherbro, as well as vegetables and prepared foods grown locally. Women traders and hawkers were especially noted by visitors, missionaries, and newly arrived government officials. By 1879, one commenter noted that, quote, from babyhood, the Yoruba girl is a trader, and as she grows up, she carries her small wares wherever she can go with safety. Unfortunately, even though this occupation dominated women's work in the census, it is difficult to estimate how much income a market woman would have contributed to the household. The introduction of ordinances in the late 1820s to charge market dues, require hawkers to have licenses, like fees, liquor, and auctioneer licenses, and raise the rate of spirits licenses suggests that the colonial government thought that the profits from these enterprises were substantial enough for the proprietors to afford these new taxes. In 1825, the spirit trading license was £5 per year. In 1827, that had gone up to £30 per year. And in 1828, up to £50 per year, before going back down to £30 the following year. Hawkers' fees were introduced in 1828 at £5 in Freetown and £3 outside of Freetown. In 1831, the government reported £26 5 shillings, or 0.3% of their annual revenue, from hawkers' fees. And market fees were introduced in 1829, £2 per quarter for private market stalls, 7 shillings per month for a market table for small dealers. What's most notable about the proliferation of hawkers and traders in Freetown, and especially of women hawkers and traders, is that most households also include liberated African domestic servants. Liberated Africans made up 44% of the population of Freetown in 1831, and in central Freetown, 504 of the 732 liberated Africans were servants, and 139 were market traders. In the 1831 census, apprenticeship of liberated Africans would still have been practiced, in which case the servants listed as liberated Africans were probably only given room, board, and clothing rather than a wage. Francis White argues that recaptured liberated Africans apprenticed to families in Freetown, quote, gave men an alternative to plural wives as a source of labor, and freed the women of the household from daily chores, which enabled them to go into the market. So these West African cities, like Freetown, provide an interesting window into the ways that emerging port cities organized household labor to respond to the sporadic elements of trade in the 19th century. While formal economic activity grew across the colonial period, and especially from the late 19th century, the male breadwinner model, the full-time salary job, and full employment were exceedingly rare in Freetown's history. Instead, we can see in 19th century Freetown parallels between the pre-industrial urban economy and the post-industrial economy of the present, as Seth Brockman argues for early 19th century Baltimore. Quote, both are largely service economies in which many working people lack political citizenship, are acted upon by multiple forms of inequality, and do not produce actual goods that can be sold for profit, and yet the economy cannot function without them. Combining welfare ratio calculations with the census data allows us to see how households engage with the market, and what different wage rates in addition to more informal work, would mean for their economic security. It was clear that the breadwinner model was an anomaly. Women all worked, and the majority worked outside the home as traders, hawkers, or in another person's home as domestic laborers. The role of women as marketers also raises a methodological question about how to quantify production from the home for the market, as well as how to think about the economic efficiencies of buying in through enslavement, polygamy, wardship, or apprenticeship domestic help. Freehold ownership and multifamily households both improved the standard of living significantly. But so did flexible employment opportunities that supplemented other income-generating activities. Having a large household could mean more mouths to feed, but it also meant more resiliency to lost earnings, bad trading seasons, or lack of work. Thanks very much, and again, really sorry that we were not there.
Merci. Merci. Nous allons passer donc à Hilary G. Jones. La communication de Hilary G. Jones. Ensuite, on termine par vous, doyen.
I'm afraid I cannot hear the presentation. I am ready to go. No volume. Hilary. No volume. Vous avez vu le message? Mais il n'y a pas de volume.
Il faut monter le volume.
Hello, should I start? So I will go ahead and start with the presentation. I'm sorry that I am not there with you in person. I sent a PowerPoint presentation, so I don't know if I should share my screen or perhaps it's there. Okay, well, not that presentation. So you can take that down because it was a PowerPoint. But if you don't have it, then don't worry. You can just stop sharing the screen and I will just speak. Okay, all right. Well, greetings everyone from the US, and my apologies for not being here with you. I'm going to tell you a little bit about this paper, which is called From Martinique to Senegal, Slavery, Deportation, and a New Labor Frontier in the French Atlantic World. I will say a few words just to introduce it to you, and then I will explain for you the case study and make some conclusions so as not to spend too much time. This paper is essentially research that I did in the archives, the National Archives in Senegal, and also in the departmental archives, the French departmental archives in Martinique, on an episode of the deportation of free people of color and slaves from the French Caribbean to Senegal. And it's part of a longer book that I'm working on that's about the interconnected histories of Senegal and the French Caribbean from the end of the Haitian Revolution until the period of post-colonial Senegal. So at the outset, I should say that I am not a labor historian, and when Professor Fall and I talked about this conference, I was very concerned that this paper might not fit into the themes of global labor history. But just hearing the last presentations by Sven Beckert and the comments that were made in the discussion, it really makes me realize that this is an important subject to think about globally. And this work, in particular this chapter,
is concerned with questions of African diaspora. And my previous research has focused primarily on 19th century Senegal and on the towns of Saint-Louis and Gorée and Rufisque as the emergence of the Senegal colony in the 19th century happens around these Atlantic coastal towns. And one of the questions that I have been concerned with is one, what is this problem of deportation and exile that is part of the history of slavery in the French Atlantic? Two, and this may connect with the presentation before mine, is that scholars have researched the history of liberated Africans, of those who were part of the last years of the transatlantic slave trade and settled in regions like Freetown and Sierra Leone. But very little attention has been paid to the Senegal side of this, and particularly because Senegal, of course, was not Freetown, but there is archival evidence that shows us that some of the same concerns, issues, policies that were shaping the end of slavery in the Atlantic world were also affecting the ways in which the French were organizing their colonial activities in Saint-Louis du Senegal in particular. So the question of the Atlantic world and the end of the slave trade is one that has been of interest of mine. And then lastly, this paper enters into discussions about African diaspora, and particularly the work of sociologist Ruth Sims Hamilton, who talks about the geospatial mobilities of African peoples, and particularly those who were the result of the involuntary migration flows. And so often in our literature about African diaspora, Africa becomes the site in which enslaved people are trafficked out of, and very little do we think about the ways in which the patterns and processes of labor migration also affected the makings of African society spaces, particularly those of colonial towns like Saint-Louis, Senegal. And in previous research, I examined the ways in which labor regimes were reconfigured in the middle of the 19th century as a result of the kinds of policies and practices that officials were employing to create the patterns of colonialism that we see come to fruition in the late 19th century. So I want to take just a few minutes to tell you about this particular case study that I've been working on. It's no surprise to us that the concept of exiling slaves as punishment was not unique to the French Atlantic or even to slavery in world history generally. Slaves were banished from the British West Indies, from British colonial Virginia, and then the Spanish colonial Puerto Rico. These places accepted slaves from French territories who had been exiled from the Caribbean, even going back to before the French Revolution. And so it's no surprise that colonial officials and planters in the Caribbean used metropolitan laws and extra-legal systems to punish, discipline, or otherwise control enslaved people. So in this paper, I'm particularly looking at the outcome of the Haitian Revolution, which sparked a kind of hysteria among planter classes in Martinique and Guadeloupe. And this has been well documented by other historians, which I can name. So this is not necessarily new. But in the French Caribbean, what they show is that fears of free people of color who are arguing for full citizenship and taking up the cause of anti-slavery created a kind of anxiety among Creole planters in the islands. And as a result, they used these extrajudicial measures to criminalize, and this is a kind of problematic term, but to criminalize enslaved people and free people of color. At deportation from the Caribbean to Senegal happened beginning in the mid-1820s. And around the same time, what we see in the African context, in the Senegalese context, is the creation of this new Senegal colony coming out of the Napoleonic Wars, in which certain French officials, and I'm thinking particularly here of Governor Roger, thought about or began to orchestrate the creation of a new plantation scheme in what we know today as Richard Toll in the Senegal River Valley in the territories of the Wolof Kingdom of Wallo. And so, as a result, during this time period, what we see is a kind of, if not coordination, but the kind of coming together of these two policies that create a situation in which enslaved people and free people of color from the Caribbean are being deported to Senegal and used as part of the labor forces of Richard Toll and in Saint-Louis, Senegal. So let me just explain the nature of this particular event. So if we think about the Caribbean context here, after the expulsion of French planters from Haiti, administrators in the overseas departments of Martinique and Guadeloupe, well, they were not departments then, but in the colonies of Martinique and Guadeloupe, resorted to even harsher and more brutal tactics to reimpose the slave regime in the French Caribbean. To deal with the threat of slave insurrection, or even of poor whites who were conspiring with free people of color, Martinique's planter class used an 1817 decree that allowed the governor to call a special council in cases that he considered to be a threat to public security. And so as a result, between, this meant that the council alone had the authority to deport individuals that it determined were a threat to public peace. Between 1819 and 1821, 11 petits blancs, as they were called, were charged and deported from Martinique to the US or France for offenses that ranged from eating or drinking with free mixed race and enslaved people, or to engaging in sexual relations with enslaved women, and even public intoxication. On the night of October 12th of 1822, 30 to 40 slaves revolted while working on a canal bordering the wealthy plantations in Carbet, which was south of the town of Saint-Pierre in Martinique. And this uprising confirmed rumors that essentially, the rumors that had been circulating that the enslaved were conspiring to poison planters and their animals in order to overturn the plantation economy. And so as a result, the island military put down the insurrection, but 2 years after this, it created this sort of hysteria, a fear that there would always be an insurrection of people who were against the planter regime. So that 2 years later, the Bisset affair, which engulfed the island of Martinique, and again, centered around the town of Saint-Pierre, which was a commercial hub for the colony and a place where a number of free people of color lived, another insurrection occurred, or another uprising occurred around the Bisset affair, in which Cyril Bisset, who was a free man of color and a wealthy estate owner, was found guilty of passing around pamphlets that argued that free people of color should be afforded equal rights as Frenchmen. And he was charged with being the organizer of a conspiracy. The French officials in Martinique rounded up 200 men and women. The Bisset and the co-conspirators were first sentenced to be slaves for the French Navy, branded and then exiled to France. But then a second trial exculpated the co-conspirators and pardoned Bisset. But in this affair, in this Bisset affair, 40 of the 200 of these individuals who were accused from Saint-Pierre were deported to Senegal. On March 8, 1824, 40 deportees left Port Royal, and they arrived in Gorée on August 12, 1824. All free men of color, categorized as mulat and the men ranged in age from 58 to 25. And there are various observations in the documents about these individuals as property owners, but they're also described in the registers of them in Senegal as people with few means. Some worked as carpenters, tailors, bread makers, masons, leather workers, or farmers in Martinique, and then a few owned coffee plantations, according to these notations.
Hilary, you have 2 minutes. 2 minutes too.
Back to Martinique. But when they arrived, 19 of those who arrived in Saint Louis were employed, this is what the notations say, were employed in the Senegal river trade. Governor Baron Roger thought that the most able would be useful as workers on the plantation scheme, as Richet had told. After the Bisset affair, the Naval Ministry made reforms to the judicial system, but Creole planters in Martinique continued to use these extrajudicial measures to implement deportation. This time they targeted, for expulsion from the colony, slaves of planters who found them to be a problem and wanted to send them home back to Africa, right? Or essentially expel them out of the colony of Martinique. And some were accused of poisoning their master's cattle. Others were accused of being, threatening their owners, and some were deemed to be old and infirm and therefore no longer useful on the plantation. So on September 6, 1826,
time is up. Time is up. Time is up.
For deportation of
Nous allons donc passer la parole à Monsieur Sen, Abdoulaye Sen. Vous avez besoin du micro?
In this case study, there were 2 or 3 other ways of deportation. This time of people who did not have the same advantage for people to go back to Martinique.
Hilary, time is up. Time.
A record of all of the individuals who remained in Senegal after when the Second Republic ended slavery in
il faut la couper alors. Time's up. Time is up. Thank you. Thank you. Bien, on passe à Michel Sen.
Merci, Mbok. Bonjour tout le monde. Ah bon? Oui. Alors, le thème de ma communication porte sur les pêcheurs piroguiers, comme on les appelle, les véritables travailleurs de la mer, sur les problèmes de mobilité et les défis transfrontaliers auxquels ils sont confrontés en Afrique de l'Ouest. J'essaierai de vous présenter de manière très simple des choses extrêmement compliquées pour avoir les informations d'abord et pour savoir qui est qui. Alors, mais très simplement, il faut savoir que la pêche en mer se déroule de 2 manières. Ou c'est une pêche côtière ou c'est une pêche hauturière. La pêche côtière, elle est le fait de la pirogue. La pêche hauturière, elle est le fait du navire, la flottille industrielle. Ces deux types de pêche, dans leur existence actuelle, sont des activités migrantes. Et ça, il faut le comprendre d'abord que ce sont des activités migrantes. Pardon. C'est mon épouse. Alors, ouais. Alors, il se trouve que dans cette pêche-là, quand elle se met en place, nous avons d'abord, au plan du littoral, sur la côte, une pêche de subsistance qu'on a appelée traditionnelle. De l'autre côté, on a une flottille dite pêche industrielle parce qu'elle est celle-là qui est moderne. Mais ces deux types de pêche vont être confrontés aux mêmes préoccupations. Elles seront obligées de migrer pour se maintenir en tant qu'activité. Ensuite, elles ne sont particulièrement du côté de la pêche piroguière, c'est une activité qui est professionnelle, où on va de prime abord sortir de toutes les préoccupations ethniques pour aller en mer. Et ça le point de départ, c'est Saint-Louis. Quand la pêche en mer est un métier, c'est un nouveau métier. Antérieurement, il n'y avait pas de pêche en mer du fait parce qu'une ethnie est particularisée pour la pêche en mer. Toute activité maritime était liée, non seulement elle est côtière de faible envergure, mais également elle est associée à d'autres activités dites par exemple traditionnelles, ou bien liées à l'activité portuaire tel que sera le cas de Dakar, le cas de Rufisque, mais également chez les Nyominka, pour le cas du Sénégal, dans les îles du Saloum. Pour Saint-Louis, c'est les gens qui ont été débarqués du commerce colonial, du commerce des comptoirs, mais également qui vont tirer profit de toute la technologie du commerce fluvio-maritime. Et c'est sur cette base-là que c'est les gens qui ont été déflatés, prenons le terme aujourd'hui, du commerce autour de Saint-Louis, qui vont se lancer à la mer. Et c'est pourquoi je dis à un moment donné que les Guendariens, plus décisifs en raison de la fin du commerce, du comptoir et du déclin de Saint-Louis, vont observer un mouvement balancier du nord au sud et à la faveur des points de débarquement, ils vont s'établir temporairement jusqu'en Guinée, de manière saisonnière, avant de s'implanter aussi définitivement dans des villes comme Rufisque, Dakar, Mbour, Banjul, Ziguinchor et Conakry. Et ça, on va voir les quartiers dans lesquels ils habitent. La dénomination guendarienne ou Dandar existe déjà dans ces zones-là. Si je reste simplement encore au niveau du Sénégal, il faut savoir que les Lébou de la presqu'île du Cap-Vert et les Nyominka des îles du Sud s'adonnent à la pêche, donc, comme je l'ai dit tantôt, en l'associant à l'agriculture, à l'élevage ou aux activités portuaires au gré de leur environnement économique. Quand les ponts des rivières du Sud vont cesser de fonctionner, les Nyominka vont aller en mer. Ils vont laisser le travail des bas-bolons, etc. et des mangroves. Le phénomène des migrations de travail va être donc à la base de l'essor de la pêche maritime et de l'adhésion des autres communautés traditionnelles vivant de la pêche de subsistance déjà. On dispose beaucoup d'informations sur la mise en place du système migratoire et du contexte en Afrique de l'Ouest entre 1880 et 1980. En l'absence de processus d'industrialisation, les populations locales s'adonnent dans la pêche en mer. Les Soubalbés du fleuve Sénégal, les Wolofs de Ndiago en Mauritanie, les Diola de Casamance, les pêcheurs autochtones du fleuve Gambie et les Soussous de Guinée. On trouve sur cette côte des travailleurs marins de grand renom. Donc il y a le foyer sénégalais, mais aussi il y a le foyer ghanéen. Mais il faudra remarquer que les migrations ne sont pas linéaires, elles sont dynamiques, elles peuvent s'étendre et se contracter et se redéployer également. Mais depuis l'ère coloniale, à nos jours, avec les groupes saint-louisiens Lébou et Nyominka, les Thème de Sierra Leone et les Fanti du Ghana, pour revertir plus tard les formes d'immigration clandestine vers l'Espagne. Donc quand on parle de migration, ça ne va pas s'arrêter simplement sur l'activité de la pêche, mais c'est autour de la pirogue. C'est pourquoi moi, dès le départ de mes travaux, depuis plus d'une trentaine d'années, moi je parle de la pêche piroguière maritime. Je ne parle pas du navire ou de la flottille industrielle. Ce n'était pas mon propos. Mais je vais les rencontrer forcément, ou au niveau de la mer, ou dans mes recherches. Les menaces. Non, disons d'abord que dès le début de la colonisation, la France et les pays européens exportent progressivement leur capacité de pêche en Afrique de l'Ouest. C'est une forte migration de flottilles industrielles européennes qui a permis la régénération de leurs pêcheries et un repos biologique des aires marines et des écosystèmes en Europe. Ça, c'est très clair. Et vous pouvez le voir quand vous ferez une cartographie des pêcheries européennes de Libérie, en tout cas Portugal, Espagne, etc., mais également de l'Angleterre, vous allez voir quand leur flottille se déploie jusqu'à Saint-Pierre et Miquelon, ils laissaient leur mer, leur zone se reposer. Les menaces. Ah, une chose qu'il faut dire également, cette migration est subventionnée et encadrée par les politiques communautaires européennes. Et ça, c'est important. Les menaces sur les ressources halieutiques des pêcheurs locaux vont de plus en plus se manifester après les indépendances. Cette tendance se poursuit avec la politique commune des pêcheries européennes et s'internationalise avec d'autres flottilles. Je veux parler de la Corée, de la Russie et de la Chine, mais aussi je pense que la Turquie aussi est entrée dans la danse. La pêche illégale ne laisse pas compter le pillage dans le pillage et la destruction des ressources marines avec des opérateurs privés étrangers, mais de tout acabit. Et on va avoir des navires qui vont venir de l'Europe engager les pirogues, ce que j'appelle les bateaux ramasseurs, engager les pirogues et les mener dans les eaux internationales. Quand on arrive dans les eaux internationales, on débarque les pirogues qui vont pêcher en mer. Ce que j'appelle le phénomène bateau ramasseur. Ouais, je les ai appelés dans les années 80 bateaux ramasseurs. Les communautés du littoral ouest africain assistent sans défense à la diminution des ressources halieutiques et la destruction des habitats naturels de la zone où elles sont confinées par la motorisation. Je signale bien, la motorisation n'est pas un développement de la pêche artisanale. Oui, c'est la faiblesse du capital français qui n'a pas... C'est la faiblesse du capitalisme français qui n'a pas pu développer cette pêche artisanale, mais au profit de leur propre flottille. Nous avons des parents qui ont quitté ici Saint-Louis, aller en Gambie uniquement avec la voile carrée, aller et retour en fonction des saisons. Mais ici, il y a plus de rapidité, par exemple, par rapport au... Mais vous savez que ces moteurs hors-bord là qu'on a introduits dans... Mais c'est des moteurs de plaisance. Jusqu'à ce jour, elles sont encore des moteurs de plaisance, alors que les pêcheurs sont en train de demander, sont en train de vouloir une dieselisation de leur embarcation. Alors, l'autre phénomène aussi qu'on peut observer, c'est que, comme je l'ai dit, nos pêcheurs vont être victimes du pillage des ressources. Les communautés du littoral n'ont pas bénéficié de compensations significatives et importantes pour assurer un développement moderne des pêcheries. Les conditions hydroclimatiques, surtout de la boiling dans la région ouest africaine, devraient permettre des pêcheries, mais capables de nourrir le Sahel. Nous sommes dans l'une des zones les plus productives de la planète. Il faut constater que la faible capacité de nos unités de pêche locales ne profite qu'à la flottille étrangère. Parce que si nous avions un développement industriel de nos pêcheries, mais on va les rencontrer là où ils sont en train de puiser, ils ne viendront plus puiser nos propres ressources. Quand nous faisons le repos biologique dans nos aires marines protégées, eux le soir, ces flottilles-là viennent enlever tout ce qu'il y avait là-bas. Et le lendemain, les pêcheurs, ou en tout cas à la fin de la période de repos, vont se retrouver dans le baba. Autre aspect aussi qu'il faudrait soulever, les pêcheurs piroguiers, moi que je considère comme des travailleurs de la mer, migrants par vocation, vont connaître et subir une réalité politique faite de conflits entre diverses nationalités, d'absence de stratégie de politique sous-régionale et d'un manque de vision partagée des États de la CEDEAO. Ce que nous connaissons là actuellement, les différents conflits, cette année il y en a eu entre Sénégalais et Guinéens, entre Sénégalais et Bissau-Guinéens, entre Sénégalais et Gambiens. Si vraiment on avait une véritable politique de la CEDEAO, une véritable politique de pêche, on ne connaîtrait pas ces problèmes-là. Il y a un aspect qui me chagrine.
Il reste 4 minutes.
D'accord, d'ailleurs je termine presque sur ça. C'est que non seulement il y a des conflits entre la pirogue et le navire qui vont se multiplier, mais il y a également des contradictions entre les communautés locales, et ces contradictions vont apparaître à partir des différences de types de pêche. Par exemple, on dira à Thiaroye, on ne veut pas de filets monofilaments. Par exemple, je donne un exemple, les Guendariens ou autres, les gens de Yen qui vont venir pêcher vont utiliser ça. Or, il y a d'autres types de pêche qui peut-être qu'on avait proposé par la recherche locale, le crotte, mais qui n'ont pas fait tache d'huile. Je prends par exemple les casiers à céphalopodes. Les casiers à céphalopodes, aujourd'hui, bon, c'est pratiquement plus utilisé. Vous mangez du calamar et des trucs là, mais vous le trouverez par autre méthode de capture. Alors, donc, ces différences de type de pêche qui sont sources de conflits, mais aussi les défis transfrontaliers donc, vont concerner les pêcheurs migrants et en particulier l'administration nationale des États voisins. Même quand au niveau central, au niveau des chefs d'État, des solutions peuvent être trouvées, elles ne sont pas immédiatement, elles n'ont pas d'effet immédiat, du fait de comportement des administrations locales. Il y a également un aspect qui nous concerne, nous maintenant les chercheurs, enseignants-chercheurs. Il faut admettre que la recherche, et là je m'en tiens simplement au niveau de l'océanographie, est une recherche fondamentalement orientée selon les impératifs des puissances coloniales. La recherche coloniale, c'est la même qui se poursuit aujourd'hui. Il y a une faiblesse notoire de l'approche socio-économique depuis quelques années au niveau du CROT. Et encore que beaucoup de travaux qui ont été faits, à mon avis, ne sont qu'à une dimension de recension. Vous savez tous aujourd'hui, bon, la recension, c'est une démarche, c'est une méthode de recherche. Il faut faire cette recension d'ouvrage de ceux qui ont traité la question, et également ensuite faire l'analyse critique de ce que vous avez trouvé. Mais beaucoup de travaux sont restés là. Il n'y a plus de monographie qui te dit qu'est-ce qui se passe dans ces communautés-là. Comment ils ont réagi par rapport aux changements qui s'imposent à eux ou à elles. Mais ça là aussi, c'est parce que nous n'avons pas une recherche financée par nos propres budgets. Et ça, c'est un handicap. Donc, il faut admettre, il y a une notion aussi dans cette recherche néocoloniale qu'on trouve dans les institutions comme l'IRD. comme l'IRD par exemple, comme l'IRD, j'ai trouvé dans un document, ce qu'on appelle document de travail, ou en tout cas dans leur truc, la notion de parcours qu'ils appliquent à la pêche. Le parcours, c'est une notion tirée de la transhumance du bétail. Mais, chers amis, l'éleveur, il a son bétail, hein, à sa portée, et qu'il mène vers des zones de pâturage. Et il revient avec. Et il a la possibilité, s'il est aidé aussi par l'État, de faire de la stabulation. Mais le pêcheur, il n'a pas de bétail. Sa migration, c'est pour aller chercher le poisson là, ou les produits halieutiques là où ils sont. Tu vas comparer tout ce que leur armada... Et puis c'est une activité essentiellement aléatoire. Jusqu'au moment où aujourd'hui on a la possibilité dans les navires de géolocaliser là où se trouvent les bancs de poissons. Mais pour le pêcheur, ce n'était pas le cas. C'est une pêche essentiellement aléatoire. Tu vas à la recherche d'une ressource. Mais ce qu'il fait pas, tu ne peux pas le comparer avec un parcours de transhumance. Mais ce n'est pas possible. C'est ignorer carrément la réalité de ce que vit le pêcheur. Et c'est pourquoi, si nous voulons connaître véritablement la réalité de la pêche et ce qu'elle a apporté au niveau de l'économie nationale, il faudra connaître leurs conditions de vie et de travail.
Merci. Merci.
Sous-thème là. Bon, nous avons 4 intervenants sur ce sous-thème. Je vais essayer assez rapidement de ramasser ce que je crois être la quintessence de leur production, notamment avec Prana, le travailleur maritime et le tracé des frontières en Bengali. Il s'agit essentiellement de la mise en valeur du conflit religieux dans la partition de l'Inde, Bengale-Pakistan. Mais avec comme conséquence majeure le développement de nouvelles identités, nées de nouvelles frontières et des notions d'identité telles que marin musulman, par exemple. Donc, on aboutit à une diversité d'acteurs de la mer qui vont travailler sur différents ports et différents navires, avec donc des difficultés de s'identifier à leur nouveau statut selon les nouveaux tracés de frontières nés des conflits. Un réseau de travail relativement qualifié donc, et mobile dans l'est de l'Inde et qui travaille dans des entreprises de navigation intérieure dans des ports et des compagnies maritimes marchandes. C'est ça la difficulté, c'est ça la mutation qui est née de la question du mouvement des frontières, mais la masse de travailleurs est là, les entreprises en ont besoin et ils ont des difficultés à s'épanouir selon la situation frontalière dans laquelle ils se trouvent. C'est ça, c'est une problématique. Et ça conduit à quoi? À une marginalisation, une sorte de travail forcé, quelque part, de certains travailleurs bengalis, musulmans, vers d'autres pays, etc. Suivant le marché de la main-d'œuvre, parce qu'ici, le moteur du mouvement, c'est le marché de la main-d'œuvre, quoi qu'il arrive. Donc c'est le capital qui commande la migration. Mais c'est cette même problématique qu'on retrouve maintenant de façon beaucoup plus sédentaire au niveau du port. Le port est un élément clé de l'économie maritime. Et là, Laura a étudié au niveau du port de Freetown. C'est un exemple de port urbain qui a organisé le travail des ménages. D'abord, surtout dans un caractère informel, parce que la plupart des travaux qui se déroulent au niveau du port, c'est dans l'informel. Avec des types de rémunération qui sont différents, et dont rarement, si vous voulez, un peu des travails de type temps plein, salarié. Donc c'est plutôt du travail informel. Et ça conduit à quoi? À une perception de la pauvreté ici. La notion de pauvreté à travers le travail des femmes et des enfants en particulier. Donc il y a là une question de l'évolution de l'économie urbaine, pré- et post-industrielle, mais appliquée à un domaine maritime, notamment portuaire. ce n'est pas du tout original en soi. Sur tous les ports, en général, on retrouve la même sociologie. Et dans cette affaire-là, le rôle des femmes, en tant que commerçantes ou employées, est également très important à mettre en valeur. Parce que c'est souvent aussi les maillons faibles dans ce dispositif d'exploitation. Donc, cela dit, le travail de Hilary de la Martinique au Sénégal, à mon avis, c'est pour résumer ça assez rapidement, parce que ce n'est pas encore totalement traduit. Pour moi, c'est comme si c'était l'histoire, c'est-à-dire que c'est l'esclavage, c'est le travail forcé. Et pourquoi Saint-Louis, ce n'est pas gratuit? Le passé esclavagiste de Saint-Louis n'est pas mis en valeur aujourd'hui. Il y a une relation de travail forcé entre Saint-Louis et la Martinique et d'autres îles. Je pense que sur ce rapport-là, il y a encore du travail à faire pour les chercheurs. Donc c'est un courant migratoire de travail forcé. Je pense que je parle sous le contrôle de Babacar, qui est le spécialiste du travail forcé. Abdoulaye, quand il parle, j'ai l'impression que lui, c'est un pêcheur, quoi. Effectivement, c'est un pêcheur. Il apporte beaucoup d'informations nouvelles et dynamiques parce qu'il est encore dans la recherche. Il est non seulement dans le milieu, il est en immersion dans le milieu, et je crois qu'il doit avoir une difficulté de chercheur. Un chercheur qui est à la fois objet de sa propre recherche doit avoir une difficulté de...
C'est ça le sociologue?
C'est ça.
Comme ça qu'on définit le sociologue.
Voilà, très bien. Donc je vois qu'il apporte des informations également très intéressantes, notamment, vous voyez, sur la pêche piroguière, il a dit, mais c'est surtout la professionnalisation des pêcheurs de Guet-Ndar, sur laquelle il insiste de manière particulière, la rivalité entre la pêche industrielle et les différents types de pêche, mais surtout les menaces sur les ressources, les menaces sérieuses sur les ressources et les difficultés d'organiser le repos biologique, comme il a dit. Conséquence, la réduction de l'aire marine. Et pour illustration, au lieu d'aller chercher la Guinée, mais c'est le conflit avec la Mauritanie, dont Saint-Louis est le premier répondant, sous toutes les formes. C'est clair. Parce que la notion de frontière, on en a parlé le jour passé, ça peut être matérialisé quelque part, mais en mer, un piroguier qui prend sa pirogue motorisée, qui va chercher le poisson, il n'a pas de frontière. La seule frontière, c'est sa rencontre avec le banc de poissons. C'est tout. Donc à ce niveau-là, il est évident qu'il y a là une difficulté. Le droit de la mer, il est défini, il est codifié, tout est clair à La Haye et partout. Mais dans la réalité, le pêcheur qui se déplace, mais il est sur la mer territoriale, n'est-ce pas? Mais il va y rencontrer des acteurs qui viennent piller ces ressources qui sont propres au Sénégal, alors qu'il n'a pas les moyens d'accéder en pêche hauturière à la mer internationale. Et ça, ce n'est pas sa responsabilité, c'est la responsabilité de l'État d'organiser ça. Je reviens tout à l'heure comme recommandation, je suis d'accord avec lui, c'est des questions qu'il faut régler au niveau sous-régional, à mon avis. Donc, migration permanente de pêche. Donc, au total, je pense que j'ai essayé voilà, c'est ça, de résumer et de conclure assez rapidement, parce que je comprends les préoccupations de mon ami Gounia. C'est d'abord une problématique globale de professionnalisation des pêches. Les aspects traditionnels, donc savoir local, ancestral, qui rencontrent la globalité. La globalité qui se traduit par les aspects de modernisation de la pêche sous différentes formes. Donc il y a là, à mon avis, du global et du local qui s'enchevêtrent. Bon. Le paradoxe, c'est quoi? Le paradoxe, comme il a dit tout à l'heure, c'est que nous sommes assis sur de l'or, nous sommes sur la zone l'une des zones les plus poissonneuses pour des raisons naturelles, et paradoxalement, il nous manque du poisson. C'est ça cette équation qui est posée aux chercheurs et aux décideurs. Comment trouver cette solution? Alors, donc, les pêcheurs migrateurs sont des migrants par vocation. Non, la notion de frontière en mer, quelle balise, n'est-ce pas, terminer assez rapidement. Professionnalisation précoce, conflit persistant entre pêcheurs, échange de bonnes pratiques cependant. dans la pêche traditionnelle. Lorsque les pêcheurs de Guet-Ndar ils descendent jusqu'en Guinée, il y a un échange de bonnes pratiques également. Autre conséquence, mais cette fois négative, il a dit par ricochet, immigration clandestine par la mer, ou alors transfert d'habileté. Les gens qui vont en mer pour chercher du poisson en haute mer, ils aperçoivent l'Europe. Quand la pêche ne marche plus et qu'ils savent qu'en Europe on peut trouver du travail, ils ont l'habileté et les moyens d'aller en Europe par la pêche clandestine. Donc, difficulté locale. Non, je termine. Je termine assez rapidement. Je comprends votre préoccupation. J'ai pas. Ah bon, donc je résume. Hein? Je résume et je conclue. Conclusion. L'économie maritime est un domaine de migration de travailleurs. L'économie maritime nous montre la diversité d'acteurs aux relations complexes. Ces acteurs, c'est quoi? C'est l'État, la communauté, le capital, les institutions nationales et internationales. C'est à eux de trouver la solution à cette problématique.
L'espace maritime est un lieu qui est spécifique. Parce qu'on se rend compte qu'on doit créer deux impératifs. L'impératif de liberté de mer et l'affirmation de la souveraineté nationale. Nous avons vu aussi qu'avec le développement de la technologie, on s'est rendu compte qu'il y a une maîtrise non seulement des richesses halieutiques, mais offshore, qui sont en fait source de convoitise. Et ça crée des conflits. On se rend compte aussi que ce milieu qui est en fait spécifique crée des enjeux, mais qui varient en fonction de la perception que les gens ont de cet espace marin. Tout ceci fait donc qu'il est impératif qu'au niveau international, que les gens aillent dans le sens de créer des normes qui puissent permettre à chacun d'en tirer profit. Et j'ai vu que ces frontières qui sont plus ou moins invisibles, parfois créent des problèmes aux travailleurs. Parce que ce qu'on a vu avec la prestation de Perna, mais c'est ce qu'on a vu hier avec la communication de M. Sen sur le Matam. Des travailleurs se lèvent et se rendent compte que leur lieu de travail se trouve dans un autre pays. C'est ce qu'on a remarqué à Matam. Des Toucouleurs qui se retrouvent sénégalais, le lendemain, ils se rendent compte que leur lieu de travail se trouve maintenant en Mauritanie. C'est exactement ce qu'on a vu avec la partition de l'Inde. Quand il y a eu partition, mais des marins qui avaient leur lieu de travail au niveau de l'Inde, au niveau du fleuve Pendjab, ou bien qui, à la limite, sillonnaient tous les cours d'eau au niveau du Pendjab, se retrouvent confinés, parce qu'il y a une nouvelle frontière qui est tracée. Donc il faudrait que, sur le plan international, qu'il y ait des normes qui permettent vraiment de sauvegarder les intérêts de ces travailleurs. Voilà la conclusion. Donc encore une fois, merci, et vraiment on a été régalé par les 4 communications qu'on a eues, particulièrement